We'll take a look at the Mishnah, the Mirz Hashem on Daf Chaf, and this is about the earliest time you could read the Megillah on the daytime. We had two readings of the Megillah. We have the night reading in the day. That's Rabbi Shua ben Levi's famous statement. And now we have the question of when is the earliest time you could read the Megillah by day, in the daytime Megillah reading. Actually, you know what? Let's just finish up one last thing before we start the Mishnah. We'll take a look for a minute at a couple of lines before the Mishnah, because that's a very interesting piece of Gemara. The Gemara quotes Rabbi Yehuda, the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda says that a Katan could read the Megillah, which is a Pella. You know that a Katan is usually not a Bar Chiyuva, and yet he could read the Megillah. Tanya, we learned in a Brisa, Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda wants to prove that a Katan could in fact read the Megillah, and he could be Motzi a Gadol. And he says, Katan Ayisi, I was once a Katan, and I read Kriyat Shema. I read Megillah, Kriyat. And who was there in the shul? Lamala means because the Balkari would stand a little bit higher. There was a bima in the middle. Rabbi Tarfon is Kenov, Belud. Imagine in the shul in Lud, Rabbi Tarfon is there, and no one said a word. Amrulo, ein mevi'in raya min hakatan. So the Chacham said that although you're telling us a story, but we don't rely on your story because you're a katan. You can't be a kosher aid, so we don't rely on your testimony. So it's interesting because the Gemara Ksubah says that when you're a gadol, you can testify what you saw in your katans, and l'chora that works for anything that's derabanan, and Kriyas HaMegillah is derabanan. So why does the Gemara say that you can't rely on the edus, the testimony of a katan, with regard to Kriyas HaMegillah? That's the Pella. So he quotes here in the footnote the Chidah in Birkei Yosef. I have one actually here. That the din that we accept edus from a gadol on what he saw when he was a katan, that's bedavar she'im dvarav amitim tshuv ein l'stapik b'kach. Ach v'mesha heyed Rabbi Yehuda shebiyoso katan karas hamegillah fnei Rabbi Tarfon yitachin Rabbi Tarfon los kamim lotzes yidei chovas hakriya. In other words, when there are details in the story that are absolutely critical, we can't rely on a gadol who's testifying in what he saw as a katan. So maybe as a katan, he wasn't so careful about, being meticulous about those details. So Rabbi Tarfon may have heard the Megillah reading from a katan, Rabbi Yehuda, when he was a katan, but it doesn't mean necessarily that he was yotzei his chiyuv. He may have read it again, or he read it earlier. A katan might not have been so meticulous, so careful about it. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Amar Rebbe, Katan Hayisi Krasiya Lamalami Rabbi Yehuda. Now, this is a strange kind of Gemara, because how can you prove anything from the fact that as a katan, Rebbe read the Megillah in front of Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that a katan could read the Megillah on behalf of the gadol. Amrullah, the Chacham say, Ein mevi'in raya min hamatir. You can't bring a proof from Rabbi Yehuda when he himself is the author of that sheet that we rely on a katan. Because it could be that the Rabbim, the majority of the Chachamim, disagree with him. So the Gemara says, if the Rabbanan want to slug up Rebbe, why don't they just say we don't rely on what you saw as a katan? Ein mevi'im raya min hakatan. You're telling us that you read the Megillah as a katan in the presence of Rabbi Yehuda. We don't rely on testimony of something that you saw when you were a katan. Where it says chada v'yod karmulei chada the katan hayisi and afilu gadol hayisi ein mevi'in raya min hamat. So there are really two reasons here. One is built on top of the other. First of all, we don't rely on what you saw as a katan. Secondly, even if we would rely on what you saw at Katan, you read the Megillah in front of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda was the one who was mat. Mishnah says, Ein Korin es Megillah. And now the Mishnah has a whole long list of mitzvahs that require Hanetzach Chama. Which is very strange because we usually assume that daybreak is Amud HaShachar, which is quite a bit before Hanetz. Sometimes it could be a half hour, even more before Hanetz. But we're going to see, as we go through the Sugya Mitzvah, that there are Lechatchilas and B'di'evets. Because we don't want to get too close to Amud HaShachar. So therefore Hanetz, that for sure is daytime, and the sun is already shining. It's already on the horizon. So we have Kriyas HaMegillah, and then we have Lo Malin. The Torah says that meal has to be by day. B'yom hashmini yimol b'tzara loso. And then we have V'lo Tovlin. Now, again, we have to know a little bit more about Taurus as we go along in Mitzvah Hashem, but there are certain Tmeim that cannot be Tovel during, right before Herev Shemesh. They have to be Tovel in the following morning. Like, for example, a Tomei Mes. So even though it's day 7, where, let's say, a Nida could be Tovel on day 7, but not a Tomei Mes, or a Zav, for example. Zav also has to wait till the next day. And the Gemara is going to derive this from Psukim. Then we have Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom, which means that if a woman sees one Re'iyah during what's called the Yud Aleph Yomim, Bein Nida L'Nida, during that 11-day period, then she waits one full day. She needs a day that's Naki. That's called Yom Keneged Yom. So the day on which she saw Riyah, that's called the day of Tamid. And the next day, where she doesn't see any Riyah, that's called Yom Keneged Yom. And once again, the halacha is that she can begin counting that day of a day Naki on the following morning. Then we say the following: Lo titbal ad shetene tzachama. In the case of a shomeres yom keneged yom, so now what happens is that she needs one day of naki without any re'iyas dam, and that sphera, that counting of one day, as we said before, has to begin by day. But then the halacha is that all she needs is what's called miktas yom kekulo, right? All she has to do is wait part of a day, but lo titbol ad shetene tzachama. So let's say the day after her re'iyah, and now she wants to count miktas yom kekulo, she's going to have to wait until Anei Tzacham. V'kulon, again, we go through all these dinim one by one. Sha'asu b'di'eved yale misha amud hashachar kasher. So amud hashachar is already yom. That's when the day starts according to halacha. And b'di'eved will certainly, that'll be our fallback position, but l'chatchila we want to wait till Anei Tzacham. The Gemara says minolam. First, we're going to go through one by one. How do we know they require Yom? Tiyama Kra, in the case of Megillah Esther, it says, Vayomim ha'elu ha'ele niskarim v'nas. Vayom in, halayla lo. And again, as we said before, this is in addition to the Kriya of Laila. But you need a separate Kriya Bayom, and the Iker Kriya is Bayom. Tosa says back on Daf Hey that we only recite Shechiyonu Bayom. And if he reads the Megillah before Yom, even though he read it earlier at night, he's not Yotze. He needs the Megillah reading by day. So Gemara says, "Lema te'avi tuvtu Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Yom Rechub ben Levi Chayavon likos Megillah b'Layla shenos b'Yom." And the Gemara answers, "Ki kitani adi Yom." Seinachinami, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is already established that we need two kriyas, one at night and the other during the day. And that was a sugi back on Daf Dalet. But our Mishnah is not a contradiction to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, because our Mishnah is talking about the second Kriya, the one of day. Lo malin, how do we know that Mila requires day? So bayom means during the day, and Mila at night is not valid. Now, in a case where they did Mila at night, you need what's called hatafas down bris by day. Now, Tosas here, Divra Masel Dechsiv, has a stira from a Gemara in Perek Rabbi Elazar de Mila in Masechet Shabbos Daf Kuf Lamed Beis. There, the Gemara says that the pasuk Bayom Hashmini, which the Gemara here derives that it has to be by day, the Gemara there in Shabbos derives from a Bayom Hashmini afilu b'Shabbos, meaning if the 8th day of the baby's birth coincides with Shabbos, even though Mila is a malacha of Netilas Neshama, because we have to take out the dam, nevertheless, Mila overrides the Shabbos. The Gemara derives the conclusion that there's no Mila at night from a different source, a different pasuk in Parshas Vayera, when at the end of Lech Lecha, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives Avram Avinu the mitzvah of Mila, it says, "Uben Shmonas Yamim Yimol Lachem Kol Zachar Yamim V'lo Leilos." So, what is the real source for the exclusion of Mila at night? Tosfos answers that Mila at night is excluded from the pasuk Uben Shmonas Yamim in Parshas Lech Lecha. The Gemara here brings the drasha, which is a little bit simpler, even though our pasuk here of Bayom Hashmini Yimol in Vayikra Yud Beis, that's referring to Shabbos, afilu b'Shabbos. The Mishnah says, Lo tovlin v'lo mazin ad hanetzachama. Oh, I'm sorry, we skipped v'lo mazin, right? There's Efer Paraduma that requires Hazah b'shlishi u'b'shvi in the case of a Tomei Mes, and it's got to be Bayom. How do we know? This is Parshas Chukas. The Chsiv in Bamidbar Yutes, it says, Vehiza hatar al atomei Bayom Hashvi. So it says, Bayom Hashlishi, Bayom Hashvi. Our Gemara doesn't print the words Bayom Hashlishi, but in both cases, the 3rd day and the 7th day, it says Bayom. And Bayom teaches us that the Hazah of Shlishi and Shvi has to take place by day. Okay, what about Tvila? So he says, Iskash Tvila leHazoya. We now have a Hekesh between Tvila and Hazoya. The rest of the pasuk says, V'rochatz b'mayim b'toyer. So it means that the Torah is equating Hazah with Tvila. For what purpose? What's the analogy here between Hazah on Shlishi V'Shvi and Tvila at the end of the Zayin Yemei HaTumah? And the answer is that just like Hazah requires day, so too Tvila requires day. And this teaches us that the Tvila, not only of a Tomei Mes, but also the Zava or Zava, requires Yom HaShmini, during the day. And the Tvila has to be by day. So this we derive from a Hekesh. Iskish Tvila Lazoya. Now there's a Tosfos Dibra Maskil Velo, which is a gigantic Tosfos. I'll just mention one little part of that Tosfos. Tosfos asks, why do we need a Hekesh from Hazah to Tvila to teach me and establish that Tvilas Mes, in the case of a Tomei Mes, is only by day? He says, since the Hazaya has to take place by day, the Tvila, which we derive from a pasuk, must take place after the Hazaya. So since we've already derived that Hazaya is by day, and you need Hazaya on Yom HaShvi, then clearly he's got to wait till after the Hazaya for Tvila, and therefore it's got to be by day. So why do we need a special Hekesh to derive this conclusion? He says, "Memela anu yodim she'eni yochel litbo b'layla." So Tosfos says that he accepts the Riva, one of the Balei Tosfos, that Tvila in our Mishnah is not referring to Tvilas Tomei Mes, because that we derive from Hazoya, and we don't even need a Hekesh. But rather, it's referring to a different kind of Tvila. In the process of preparing the Efer Para Duma with that concoction, we need what's called Tvilas Ezov. So you have the Mei Chatos, and you take Ezov, which is like a branch of some sort of a bush, and you dip it into the Mei Chatos. And that act of Tvila is an act that has to be done by day. So the question now is, how do you derive Tvilas Ezov in Mei Chatos, Mei Efer Para, from a Hekesh to Hazoya? Hazoya is the Hazoya of Gimel and 7 for a Tomei Mes. And now you're deriving conclusions about the Tvila itself, the preparing of the Efer Para. And he writes that Mashamar Gemara Shehuksha Tvila Hazoya Haidu Shekodem Apostle Shevia Gemara Shel V'Hiza Ator Al Tomei. The previous pasuk says V'Lakach Ezo V'Tavel B'Mayim Ish Tahar, and that Tvila has a Hekesh to Hazoya. So it doesn't go from Hazoya forward the way we understood it in our Gemara, forward meaning to the next pasuk of Tvila, where it says V'Rachatz B'Mayim, but rather it goes from Hazoya backwards to the previous pasuk, which describes the requirement of Tvilas Ezo. So the Gemara now wants to know what's the chidush in this din that a shomeres yom has to be tovelos by yom pshita. Umayshna shomeres yom k'neged yom mikol chayvei tvilos. Right, the Mishnah already established that tvila is by yom. Why would I even have a havamina that tvilas shomeres yom k'neged yom should be different than all other tvilos? And he writes here that tvilas tmeim has to be by yom, and shomeres yom is also removing her state of tumah. Once again, in its long Tosfos here, he tries to push the reverse shot that the Mishnah wasn't talking about tfilas tmeim; it was talking about tfilas ezov in the Mei Chatos. Anyway, the Gemara says itzrich. So we're going to learn this Gemara based on Rashi, that the Mishnah is talking about tfilas tmeim, and from tfilas tmeim, the Gemara says we can derive the conclusion of shomeres yom k'neged yom requiring tefillah by day, and if it's cheetah, why did the Mishnah have to mention that? Itzrich. Sal kedai techamina. I would have thought that shomeres yom k'neged yom could be tovelos balayla. Why would I think so? Tehevi k're'iyah rishona shel zav. A zav also has halacha of shomer yom after he sees his first re'iyah, because he becomes a zav only after the second re'iyah. So he needs to have a yom naki separating the first re'iyah from the second re'iyah. So the first re'iyah was on a Sunday, then on Monday he didn't see any re'iyah, and then he had another re'iyah on Tuesday. In such a case, he's not a zav, because he only has one re'iyah. So that's called shomeres yom of a zav. Ure'iyah rishona shel zav. Again, there's a whole chadgadya here. So we're getting now from the analogy between shomeres yom k'neged yom in a woman who saw a dam during the Yud Aleph Yom Bein Nida L'Nida to a zav who saw re'iyah, and he also needs a shomer yom. Iskish. Now we go back and focus our attention on the re'iyah rishona of a zav. Lebal Keri. Okay, so we have a Bal Keri, and a re'iyah of Bal Keri is metamehim until the nighttime. And now we're going to equate a Re'iyah Rishon of a Zav to the Re'iyah of a Balkari. The Siv. And the Gemara quotes a pasuk now in Vayikra Tezvav, Zos Torah Sazav, Bashar Teite Mimenu Shichva Zora. So the Zav in this pasuk is a Zav who had his first Re'iyah of Ziva. And yet, the pasuk equates it with Yotzei Mimenu Teite Mimenu Shichva Zora, which is a Balkari. Ma Balkari, what do we derive from this equation? Tovel Bayom. Hainami Litbol Biyome. So it means a Balkari could be Tovel on the very day he sees Keri, and he's Tomei what's called the Tumas Erev. He needs Hariv Shimsho, and with sunset, he's Tar. And a Zav, who sees one Re'iyah, could be Tovel on the same day that he became Tomei through the Re'iyah of Zav. And then he could become Tar at night. So what's now the Havamina? We would have thought that Shomeres Yom, in the case of Dam Nida, has the same din as a Zav Baal Re'iyah Achas, who saw his first Re'iyah. And therefore, she would not have to wait until the daytime after her Re'iyah, but rather she could be Tovelis on the very day in which she saw that Re'iyah. Her din would therefore be exactly identical to that of a Zav who saw one Re'iyah, because in the case of Shomeres Yom, she only saw one Re'iyah. For her, and therefore in the case of Shomeres Yom, the Mama lo matzi tavla. But yet, we're going to come to a very strange conclusion here. That a Shomeres Yom cannot be Toveles on the very day that she saw Dam and she became Tmeah. Why? The Torah says, again in Vayikra Tesvav, I'll read the whole pasuk. It says, Ola mishkav asher tishkav olav kol yemei zova ki mishkav nidasa yeh la. In other words, we have an equation now between Zava and Nida. Right, so the Zava saw a Re'iyah during the Yud Aleph Yom, and the Nida saw a Re'iyah during her days of Nidas. And by equating the two, we derive the conclusion about Mishkav Zava, that a Mishkav Zava should have the same status as the Mishkav of a Nida. And when the pasuk says here, Kol Yemei Zova, that's a pasuk that we're learning now. What do we derive from those redundant words? Kol Yemei Zova. It could have just said Ki Mishkav Nidasa Yela. So the Gemara now is referring to a sugya in Nida on Daf Ayin Gimel, and the Gemara darshins that this pasuk Kol Yemei Zova is a reference to Shomeres Yom. And what do we derive from this reference? Zava, who sees 2 days, or even if she sees only 1 day, she's Tmeah. And when it says in the pasuk, Kol Yemei Zova ki mishkav nidasa yeh la, we darshan it that she needs shimur for these re'iyos, and they have to be by yom. In other words, we need the day after the re'iyah. B'layla miyasli evan mikza shimur v'titbol. We would have a havamina that already at night she could do a shmira, a little bit of tchilas, because in halacha, as you know, the day starts at night. So if she needs mikdas hayom kekulo as a shmira, let us start shmira at night. And then after she gets that mikdas hayom, let's say shkia was at 7, an hour goes by and she doesn't see any re'iyah, she could be toveles in this havamina at 8 p.m., an hour later, because she's already got a shmira of mikdas hayom kekulo. It's like a whole day. Kamash Malan, that's what our Mishnah wants to teach us, that a Shomeres Yom is a separate category, and the Mishnah feels compelled to give me a separate category and not include Shomeres Yom in the general category of Tmeim, but rather Shomeres Yom Eina Tovelis El B'Yom Sha'achar Riyah. So she can't be Tovelis at night after Miksa Yom of Shmira. She has to wait till the next day. And the reason for it is Kevin the Boy Sphira, because she has to count a day of Naki Keneged the day of Re'iyah. She can't count the day of Re'iyah as a Yom Naki, so there's no Shmira. And it's very similar to halacha of, let's say, a Zava Gdola who had 3 Re'iyos on 3 separate days consecutively. She has to count now 7 days of Nikiyim. Every day has to be a full-fledged Yom Naki. And now we're equating a Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom regard to 1 day of Naki to the case of a Zava Gdola who requires 7 days of Naki. And just like a Zava Gdola requires Shivas Nikiyim B'Sfira, counting 1 day after the other, so too a Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom requires a Sfira of 1 day. Sfira b'yamamahi, and the halacha is that you can, again, even though Shimur could have been Miksa Yom Kikulo, and all you would need is the nighttime, but there's another halacha of a Safra, which requires counting of a day. And Sfira b'yamamahi, you can only count a day from daybreak, not at night. That's halacha and Sfira. And the pasuk says, "V'safra la shivas yamin," in the case of his Gdola, which means that she has to count 7 full days, and by parallel, by analogy, a Shomeres Yom has to count 1 full day, and just like Shivas Yomim, it says Sfira b'yamamahi, v'safra la Shivas Yom means 7 full days, and it begins in the day. So too, a Shomeres Yom requires a full day, and therefore she cannot be Tovel until daytime. Why? Because she needs Mixas Hayom Kikulo in the daytime. There's no Mixas Hayom Kikulo at night because the Torah requires Sfira. If it was only Din of Shmira, then the day starts at night. But in halach of Sfira, the Torah says Yomim. Yomim means you count days.